What happens when a pilot's arrogance costs him everything? A racist captain, secure in his cockpit, tells a black passenger to know her place in front of a packed first-class cabin. He thinks he's the king of the sky, the ultimate authority on his aircraft. But he's about to learn a devastating lesson. The woman he just insulted isn't just a passenger holding a ticket. She's the one person who holds the power to end his career and the entire airline's reputation with a single phone call. And she's about to make it. The grounding of Flight 828 isn't just a delay. It's the beginning of the most expensive mistake of his life. Before we begin, comment where you are watching from today, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now, let's get into it. Denver International Airport, DIA, known to locals as DEN, was a sea of controlled chaos. The high tent-like ceilings of the Yepesen terminal did little to disperse the anxious energy of a Tuesday morning. Travelers rushed past, a blur of rolling suitcases and stressed expressions. At Gate B44, the atmosphere was even thicker. Crosswind Airlines Flight 828 to Atlanta was boarding, and the gate agent, a woman named Brenda with a strained smile and aggressively blonde-streaked hair, was already losing her patience. "Group 4, we are boarding Group 4 only," she snapped into the microphone, her voice echoing with a metallic twang. Dr. Imani Sinclair stood quietly in the priority boarding line. She was dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue blazer, a simple silk shell, and dark trousers. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek professional bun. In her hand, she held a standard-issue carry-on roller bag. By her feet sat a smaller, heavy-duty aluminum briefcase. She was the picture of an unassuming, successful business traveler. She was also, at 38, one of the youngest and most feared senior aviation safety inspectors for the Federal Aviation Administration, specializing in human factors and crew resource management. She was at DIA today not as a passenger, but as an auditor. Crosswind Airlines had been flagged. An anonymous tip line, usually full of disgruntled ex-employees, had recently seen a spike in credible reports concerning the DEN to ATL route, rushed pre-flight checks, intimidating behavior from senior pilots, and a culture of silence among junior crew. Imani was here on a red team audit, an undercover test to see if the crew would follow protocol under minor manufactured stress. Her stress test had already begun. Brenda, the gate agent, had looked at Imani's first-class ticket and then at her face, and a fractional, almost invisible sneer had tightened her lips. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to check your bag," Brenda had said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "It's a standard domestic carry-on," Imani replied calmly, gesturing to the metal sizer next to the podium. "It fits perfectly." "Our flight is very full today," Brenda said, her eyes flicking to the other first-class passengers, mostly white, mostly male, who were boarding without issue. "We need to make space. It's policy." "Your policy, Crosswind 3, 4.1, states that first-class passengers are guaranteed overhead space for one regulation bag," Imani said, her voice even. "I'm happy to place it in the sizer for you." Brenda's face flushed. She hated being quoted. "Ma'am, I'm the one in charge of this gate. I'm telling you it needs to be checked." "I'll carry it on," Imani stated, not as a request. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Fine, but if it doesn't fit, it's coming right back out." Imani simply nodded and proceeded down the jet bridge. As she walked, she saw the flight crew, the captain and his first officer, standing at the entrance to the cockpit, observing the boarding process. The captain, a man in his late 50s with a shock of silver hair and a deep tan, watched her approach. He had an arrogant, proprietary air about him, his arms crossed. His name tag read, Captain Marcus Rourke. He watched Imani walk past him, his eyes lingering on her with an expression she knew all too well. It wasn't just observation, it was judgment. He smirked at his co-pilot, a younger man who quickly looked away. Imani made a quiet mental note. Attribute, hostile command climate, nonverbal intimidation, failure to support ground staff in de-escalation. She found her seat, 2A, a plush leather window seat. She easily lifted her carry-on into the overhead bin, where it fit with several inches to spare. She then took her aluminum briefcase and slid it under the seat in front of her. It contained her diagnostic equipment, encrypted recorders, and credentials. It was never ever to be checked. She was settling in, pulling out a copy of Aviation Week when a shadow fell over her. It was Mark, the senior flight attendant, a thin man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said in a tone that suggested he wasn't. "That case can't be there." Imani looked up. "Pardon? It fits entirely under the seat as per regulation." "It's a first-class cabin, ma'am," Mark said, as if explaining something to a child. "We need to keep the floor area clear for comfort. It needs to go overhead." "The overhead bin for my row is full," Imani said, pointing up, "and this item cannot be stowed in a different compartment. It must remain with me. It fits the dimensions for a personal item, and it is secure." This was the second part of the test. A minor, reasonable passenger request. The correct procedure was for the flight attendant to acknowledge the regulation and, if necessary, find a different, suitable location, or simply accept that it was, in fact, compliant. Mark's smile tightened. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist it's a safety issue." "It is not a safety issue," Imani said, her voice remaining perfectly level. 14 CFR Part 121.589 is very clear that each passenger shall store his or her baggage under a passenger seat. This is in compliance. Like Brenda, Mark was visibly angered by the citation of regulations. He clearly wasn't used to passengers who knew the rulebook better than he did. "You're delaying our departure," he hissed. "I am seated and secure. You are the one delaying departure," Imani replied. Mark's face turned red. He spun on his heel and marched toward the cockpit. "Captain, we have a situation in 2A. Imani took a slow, deep breath and discreetly tapped the side of her smartwatch. The high-fidelity audio recorder in her briefcase was now active. The curtain dividing the galley from the cabin was shoved aside with a sharp swoosh of plastic rings on metal. Captain Marcus Rourke emerged, filling the aisle with his self-importance. His pilot's jacket was unbuttoned, and he wore his hat, something most pilots removed once inside the aircraft. It was a power move, an immediate visual signifier of his rank. First Officer Evans, the younger co-pilot, hovered nervously behind him, technically a violation of the sterile cockpit rule, as the cabin door was still open and they were in the process of boarding. "What is the problem here?" Rourke boomed. The entire first-class cabin and half of economy went silent. Mark, the flight attendant, pointed. "This lady, Captain. She's refusing to store her bag. She's quoting regulations at me and won't put her case in the overhead." Rourke fixed his gaze on Imani. It was a look designed to pin her in place, to intimidate and belittle. He didn't see a person. He saw an obstacle. And as his eyes raked over her, his expression curdled with a clear, undisguised prejudice. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low growl, "I am the captain of this aircraft. My word is law here. The flight attendant told you to move the bag. You will move the bag. Now." Imani met his stare. Her heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. She had faced men like Rourke her entire career, men who mistook their seniority for godhood. "Captain Rourke," she said, her voice professional and clear. "I am in full compliance with FAA regulations. My personal item is secured under the seat in front of me and does not obstruct the aisle. There is no safety violation. If you are concerned about finding overhead space, I'm sure we can—" "I am not concerned," Rourke snapped, cutting her off. "I am giving you an order. You are delaying my flight. We have a wheels-up time to hit. Put the bag up or I will have you removed from my plane." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. The other passengers stared, some with embarrassment, others with a cold curiosity. "Removing a revenue passenger who is in full compliance with federal law would be a serious action, Captain," Imani said. "It would require you to file a detailed report with your airline and with the FAA, citing the specific safety regulation I am violating." Rourke's face, already ruddy, went a deep, dangerous purple. He was not used to being challenged, and certainly not by a black woman in 2A. He took a step closer, bending over her, invading her space. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper that was still loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. "I don't know who you think you are," he spat, the smell of stale coffee on his breath. "But you are a guest on this aircraft, my aircraft. You don't quote rules to me. You don't tell me how to do my job. Frankly, people like you should be grateful to be in this cabin at all." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the cabin. First Officer Evans winced and looked down at his shoes. Mark, the flight attendant, looked triumphant. Imani's blood ran cold, but her expression remained a mask of placid inquiry. "People like me, Captain? Please clarify that." Rourke leaned in even closer, his eyes burning with rage and a lifetime of unchecked privilege. "You heard me. You come on here thinking you own the place. You need to learn to know your place. Now, for the last time, move the bag." He punctuated each word, jabbing his finger toward the overhead bin. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet, the ding of a passenger's text message from the back of the plane sounded like a gunshot. Imani Sinclair held his gaze for 1, 2, 3 long seconds. The human factors audit was over. This was now a major security and conduct investigation. She did not raise her voice. She did not break eye contact. She simply said, "Thank you for that clarification, Captain. You've made your position perfectly clear." Rourke smirked, believing he had won. He crossed his arms, waiting for her to comply. "Good. Now that we've established that, move it." Imani slowly, deliberately reached not for her bag, but for the phone in her blazer pocket. "Captain," she said, her voice changing. The manufactured calm of the passenger was gone, replaced by a new tone, an ice-cold, resonant authority that sliced through the cabin. "You have failed your crew resource management audit." Rourke's smirk faltered. "My what?" Imani held her phone to her ear. It had been connected to the FAA's secure operations line before she even boarded. She had one number on speed dial. "This is Inspector Imani Sinclair, FAA Federal Air Marshal Service. Badge 771 Alpha. I'm on the flight deck of Crosswind 828, Gate B44, Denver International. I'm invoking my authority under 14 CFR Part 119, Section 59. Rourke's face went from purple to a sickly, mottled white. The blood drained from it so fast he looked like he might faint. His co-pilot, Evans, audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Imani continued, her voice ringing with the absolute power of the federal government. "I am declaring this flight operationally non-compliant due to a hostile and compromised command environment and a direct violation of civil rights and crew conduct protocols by the pilot in command. This flight is grounded, effective immediately. Scramble the gateside security and operations team. I want the entire crew, flight and ground, detained for immediate debriefing. And get me the head of Crosswind's North American operations on the line. Now." She pressed end and looked up at the frozen, horrified face of Captain Marcus Rourke. "You said this was your aircraft, Captain," she said, her voice lethally quiet. "You are mistaken. Right now, this is my crime scene." The seconds later that the title promised was not an exaggeration. It was a chain reaction. Rourke was still standing over her, his mouth open, a statuesque monument to his own stupidity. The word inspector was still echoing in the silent cabin. From the cockpit, they heard a new voice, the Den Tower controller, his transmission now patched through to the cabin speakers by the terrified First Officer Evans. "Crosswind 828 Tower. We have an FAA red flag directive. All operations are suspended. I repeat. Crosswind 828, you are grounded. Do not move. A security team is en route to your position." The jet bridge thumped against the side of the plane as it was redocked. The cabin door, which Mark had just closed, was unlocked and thrown open. Standing there was not Brenda. It was 2 DIA police officers and a stern-looking man in a Crosswind Airlines corporate suit, his face ashen. He was the station manager. "Inspector Sinclair?" the manager said, his voice trembling. "I'm Robert Sterling. We just got the call from the tower. What's going on?" Imani stood up. She unclipped the lanyard that had been hidden under her blazer and looped it around her neck. The gold and enamel FAA credentials settled on her chest, glinting under the cabin lights. "Mr. Sterling," she said, striding into the galley. She was no longer a passenger. She was the investigator in charge. "This aircraft is under an active FAA investigation. Captain Rourke and his entire crew are to be relieved of duty, effective immediately." "Relieved?" Rourke finally found his voice. It was a weak, reedy squawk. "You can't do that. I'm the captain. This is an outrage." Imani turned to him, her eyes like chips of obsidian. "Captain Rourke, you have just demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment. You verbally assaulted a passenger. You displayed overt racial bias, and you created a hostile environment that made it impossible for your junior crew to challenge you. That is the definition of a human factors failure, the kind that causes planes to fall out of the sky. You are a liability." She turned to the police officers. "Please escort Captain Rourke, First Officer Evans, and Flight Attendant Mark to the operations center. They are not to speak to one another. They are not to use their personal phones. Their FAA licenses are provisionally suspended, pending my full report." "Suspended?" Mark shrieked, his face crumbling. "For what? For a bag? For what?" Imani's voice was sharp. "For complicity. For escalating a simple passenger inquiry into a confrontation. For failing to de-escalate when your captain became abusive. You failed your primary duty. Safety. You were too busy enjoying the show." One of the officers stepped toward Rourke. "Captain, sir, you need to come with us." Rourke looked wildly around the cabin, at the passengers who were now all filming him with their phones. He saw his career, his pension, his entire identity evaporating. He looked back at Imani, his eyes pleading. "Wait. Look. I apologize. I was stressed. The schedule. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to tell me to know my place?" Imani asked. "Or were you just angry that the person in 2A, the one questioning you, was me?" She left the question hanging in the air. She had no interest in his answer. "Get him off my aircraft," she ordered. Rourke, the man who had been the king of his domain 5 minutes earlier, was wordlessly escorted off the plane, his hat now clutched in his trembling hand. He looked like a shell of a man. Mark was led off next, sobbing openly. First Officer Evans, pale and shaking, followed, his head bowed in shame. The passengers were stunned. A few started to clap. Imani turned to the remaining junior flight attendant, a young woman named Chloe, who was hiding in the galley, tears streaming down her face. "Were you intimidated by Captain Rourke's behavior?" Imani asked, her voice softening slightly. Chloe nodded, unable to speak. "Did you feel you could not speak up to correct him or Mr. Johnson?" Chloe nodded again. "That, Mr. Sterling," Imani said to the station manager, "is the culture of silence we were warned about. Your entire crew is rotten, starting from the top." She then turned to the cabin and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Inspector Sinclair with the FAA. This flight has been canceled due to a crew safety violation. We understand this is a major inconvenience. Crosswind Airlines will be rebooking you on the next available flights and providing full compensation, hotel vouchers, and meal vouchers for your trouble. Please gather your belongings and deplane in an orderly fashion. Your phones," she added, looking at the people still recording, "will be very useful. Please send your footage to the email address I am about to write on this whiteboard. You have all just become witnesses in a federal investigation. The operations center at DIA is a windowless beige room that smells of industrial-grade coffee and anxiety. It's where the hard decisions are made, and it was about to become a career graveyard." Imani Sinclair sat at the head of a long, polished table. Her aluminum briefcase was open, its contents, a digital recorder, a biometric scanner, and a stack of files, neatly arranged in front of her. Across from her sat the disgraced crew, Rourke, Evans, and Mark. They were flanked by the station manager, Robert Sterling, and a man who had been rushed from a downtown Denver high-rise, Harrison Finch, the vice president of operations for Crosswind Airlines. Finch looked like he had swallowed battery acid. Brenda, the gate agent, was there too, looking confused and defiant. "Let's begin," Imani said, her voice echoing in the tense silence. She clicked a pen. "This is a formal debriefing following the grounding of Flight 828. This entire conversation is being recorded for the official FAA record. Let's start at the beginning. Miss Lawson." Brenda sat up, startled. "Me?" "Yes, you. Your gateside manner was the first failure of the day. You attempted to deny a first-class passenger her regulation carry-on. On what grounds?" "The flight was full," Brenda said defensively. "I was just trying to make space." "False," Imani said, not looking up from her file. Flight 828 was booked at 81% capacity in economy and 90% in first class. There was ample overhead space, as I later demonstrated. You profiled me. You saw a black woman in the priority line and made an assumption. You then became hostile when I quoted your own airline's policy. That is a failure of customer service, and more importantly, a failure of standard procedure. It's that kind of arbitrary, biased enforcement that leads to passenger altercations. You were the one who escalated. Brenda's face went white. Imani turned her attention to Mark. "Mr. Johnson, you boarded the aircraft and instead of de-escalating the situation, you doubled down. You lied about a safety issue where none existed. When a passenger, who you believed was just a passenger, corrected you on federal regulations, you didn't check your manual. You didn't consult your partner. You ran to the captain, not to resolve the issue, but to punish the passenger for questioning you. You used your captain as a weapon." Mark sank lower in his chair. She then looked at First Officer Evans. "Mr. Evans, you have a duty to challenge. You observed your pilot in command leave the cockpit during a critical phase of boarding. You observed him become verbally abusive to a passenger. You heard him use language that was not only unprofessional, but overtly racist. And you stood there and did nothing. You said nothing. What do you think would have happened if he was making a critical error on final approach? Would you have stayed silent then too? Your silence makes you complicit. You failed." Evans looked like he was going to be sick. Finally, she fixed her gaze on the man at the center of the storm, Captain Marcus Rourke. Rourke, who had been staring at the table, forced himself to look up. His eyes were bloodshot. "I have your file, Captain. 25 years with this airline. A clean record. On paper, you are a model pilot, but today you showed me what's underneath that uniform. You showed me an arrogant, abusive, and prejudiced man who believes his rank makes him infallible." "I was having a bad day," Rourke whispered. "I'm under a lot of stress." "We are all under stress, Captain." Imani's voice was suddenly a whip crack, so loud it made everyone jump. "Stress is the job. My job is to determine if you can handle that stress or if you will crack. You didn't just crack, you shattered. You abused your authority, you humiliated a passenger based on her race, and you created a command environment where your first officer was too terrified to stop you. Do you know what human factors are, Captain? It's the study of how pilots like you are the single biggest danger in aviation. Not the weather, not the engines. You, your ego, your temper, your bias, your refusal to be questioned." She leaned forward. "Your comment, 'know her place,' was not just an insult. It was a diagnostic tool. It told me everything I need to know about your fitness to fly. You see yourself as a king, not as a public servant entrusted with the lives of 200 people. You are, in short, a disaster waiting to happen." She turned to the Crosswind executives, Finch and Sterling. "And you two, you run this airline. This culture of silence starts at the top. This man," she pointed to Rourke, "felt comfortable enough to say that, in a cabin full of witnesses, which means he's done it before and your company has done nothing." Harrison Finch, the VP, finally spoke. His voice was a strained rasp. "Inspector Sinclair, on behalf of Crosswind Airlines, I am appalled. We are appalled. This is not who we are. Captain Rourke's actions are indefensible. He is terminated. Effective immediately, as are Mr. Johnson and Miss Lawson." Brenda and Mark let out strangled gasps. Rourke just closed his eyes. "Terminations are a start," Imani said, her voice cold. "But this isn't just about 3 employees. This is systemic." Imani Sinclair was not just an inspector, she was a surgeon, and she was about to cut the cancer out of Crosswind Airlines. "Mr. Finch," she said, tapping her pen on the table, "this incident, the Den 828 red flag as it will now be known, is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a deep systemic rot in your corporate culture." Finch swallowed hard. "Inspector, I assure you, we take diversity and professionalism very seriously. We have seminars, online modules." "Your online modules are a joke," Imani cut him off, her voice laced with contempt. "They are a legal shield, not a training tool. Your problem is that you have lionized pilots like Captain Rourke for decades. You've rewarded arrogance and called it command authority. You've confused veteran with infallible. You've created a generation of co-pilots like Mr. Evans, who are taught that challenging the captain, even when he's dangerously wrong, is a career-ending move." She stood up and began to pace behind her chair, a caged lion dictating terms. This isn't about racism, not entirely. The racism was just the ugly face of the real problem, unchecked, unaccountable authority. Rourke felt he could say that to me because he believed there would be no consequences, and for 25 years you've proven him right. She stopped and looked at the terrified VP. "So here is what is going to happen. This isn't a negotiation, this is a directive." She began to list the terms, and with every word, Harrison Finch's face grew paler. 1. Crosswind Airlines is grounded, fleet-wide. "What?" Finch half yelled, leaping to his feet. "You can't. That's hundreds of flights, millions of dollars." "I can, and I am," Imani said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You are under a temporary operational stand-down. No Crosswind plane takes off from any airport in North America until I am satisfied. This is no longer just about Flight 828. This is about your entire operational certification." "My God," Sterling, the station manager, whispered, slumping in his chair. 2. You will fly in your entire senior executive team, your board of directors, and your chief pilots from every hub. They will meet me here in Denver within 24 hours. They will be attending a mandatory all-day human factors and command responsibility seminar, and I will be teaching it. 3. You are going to scrap your entire diversity training module. You are going to fund a new, multi-million-dollar training program, developed and overseen by my office. It will be an interactive, scenario-based program focused on de-escalation, unconscious bias, and the duty to challenge. Every single one of your 14,000 employees, from the CEO to the baggage handlers, will be recertified. And I, she added, will be conducting the spot checks and audits myself, in person, undercover, for the next 18 months. Finch was leaning on the table, his knuckles white. He was watching his company's stock price plummet in his mind's eye. 4, Imani continued, you will issue a public, unreserved apology, not a "we are sorry if anyone was offended" press release. A full-throated admission that your company fostered a culture that allowed the racial and verbal abuse of a passenger by a senior captain. You will name Captain Rourke, and you will state unequivocally that his behavior was the result of a systemic failure at Crosswind. You will be transparent about the grounding and the retraining. That will ruin us, Finch pleaded. The press will kill us. No, Mr. Finch, the secrecy will ruin you. The only thing that saves you now is radical, painful transparency. You will prove to the public that you are fixing the problem, or I will pull your operating certificate and Crosswind Airlines will cease to exist by Friday. Am I understood? There was no argument. There was no negotiation. It was the absolute submission of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to the federal authority of one woman they had allowed their employee to humiliate. Yes, Inspector, Finch said, his voice a dead monotone. Understood. Good, Imani said. She sat back down and closed her file. Now let's talk about the passengers from Flight 828. Every single person in that cabin is a witness. and every single one of them is about to be your worst PR nightmare or your greatest comeback story. I suggest you give them a refund, a first-class voucher for life, and a personal apology from your CEO. Today. The karma for Captain Marcus Rourke was not a single, clean lightning strike. It was a slow, agonizing fire that consumed every pillar of the life he had built, one by one. It began the instant he was led from the operations center. The walk from the secure area to the terminal's public access, with a stone-faced DIA police officer on one side and a pale, trembling Robert Sterling on the other, was a gauntlet of newfound shame. He wasn't in handcuffs. Imani had been specific about that, as this was a professional, not a criminal, debriefing. But the humiliation was just as profound. He was a captain, a man who walked through terminals with a built-in aura of authority, parting crowds like a ship's bow. Now he was a spectacle. Other airline crews, from rivals and his own company, stopped and stared. They had all heard the rumors, seen the first passenger videos that were already spreading like wildfire. They saw the king of the sky being escorted out like a common drunk. He heard the clicks of their smartphone cameras, and his face, which had been a mask of rage, crumpled into a new, unfamiliar expression: fear. He was told to surrender his airport and company ID. He placed the plastic laminated card, the one that had opened every important door in his life for 2 decades, on the counter. The security guard didn't even look at him, just swiped it and dropped it into a metal bin. The clack of the plastic hitting the metal was the sound of the first door slamming shut forever. He drove home in a daze, his hands shaking on the wheel of his luxury SUV. He was still in denial, constructing a narrative of his own victimhood. That Inspector Sinclair was a rogue agent, an activist with an axe to grind. She had entrapped him. He would call his lawyer. He would call his union. He would end her. He walked into his sprawling, sun-filled home in the Denver suburbs, a house his 6-figure salary had easily afforded. His wife, Eleanor, was in the kitchen, arranging flowers, humming along to a podcast. "Marcus, you're home early," she said, turning. Then she saw his face. "My God, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I've been suspended," he stammered. The word terminated wouldn't yet form in his mouth. "Suspended? For what? Did you bust a check ride?" "It was a passenger," he growled, the anger returning. "A non-compliant, aggressive passenger in 2A. What did you do, Marcus?" his wife asked, her voice suddenly losing its warmth. "I put her in her place," he roared. "I did my job. And the airline. Finch, they caved. They folded." Eleanor's phone buzzed on the granite countertop. It was a text from another pilot's wife. "Is this true? Look at this link." She tapped the link. It was one of the clearest passenger videos uploaded to Twitter, now X, and already at 50,000 views. She turned the phone around and Marcus watched himself, his face purple and contorted, leaning over a calm, collected black woman. He heard his own voice, venomous and clear, spit the words, "You need to learn to know your place." Eleanor looked from the phone to her husband. She said nothing. She just put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. It wasn't horror at his words. It was horror at the publicity. The denial Rourke had been building shattered. The man on that screen was indefensible. The next day, the formal notice of termination arrived via certified mail. 2 weeks later, the letter from the Federal Aviation Administration landed in his mailbox. It was not a request. It was a notice of proposed certificate action. The charge, actions contrary to the duties of a pilot in command, including behavior demonstrating a reckless and willful disregard for crew resource management, passenger safety, and federal civil rights. The proposed action, permanent revocation of your airline transport pilot certificate. This was the death penalty. Rourke's rage turned to frantic panic. He cashed in a portion of his 401k to hire the best aviation lawyer in Denver, a man who had saved the licenses of pilots who had flown drunk. At their first meeting, Rourke was all bluster. "This Sinclair is out of control. It's an illegal search. She entrapped me." The lawyer, a sharp man named Kessler, let him finish. Then he leaned forward. Marcus, I've reviewed the file. It's not just Inspector Sinclair's report. It's the audio recording from her equipment. It's the sworn affidavits from both your first officer and the junior flight attendant, Chloe, both of whom state you were unhinged and abusive. And it's the 17 different passenger videos that have been forwarded to the FAA as witness testimony. We are not fighting the facts. The facts will bury you. So what do we do? Rourke pleaded, his voice small. We plead for mercy, Kessler said, looking at his notes. We claim stress. We claim temporary impairment. We say you're a 25-year veteran who had one bad day. We try to save your pension and maybe, just maybe, get the revocation reduced to a long-term suspension. Next, Rourke went to his union. He had paid dues for 25 years. He was a senior member, a man who commanded respect. He expected them to go to war for him. He met with the senior union rep, a man he'd flown with for a decade. The rep, Tom, wouldn't look him in the eye. Marcus, I can't, he said, pushing a file across the desk. What do you mean you can't? You have to. That's your job. No, Marcus, Tom said, his voice hard. My job is to protect our pilots. It's also to protect the integrity of this profession. You didn't just yell at a passenger. You used racist language. You violated the morals clause of our own contract. You brought the entire profession into disrepute. The National Committee has reviewed the case. We can't defend you on the license. You're too toxic. You did this on a full plane and got caught on video. If we defend this, we have no credibility. We will ensure you get your vested pension, what you're legally owed. But your job, your license, you are on your own. The appeal hearing, held months later in a sterile, windowless FAA administrative building, was a formality. Rourke, in a suit that now hung loosely on him, sat listening as Imani Sinclair's report was read into the record. The audio was played. Rourke's own lawyer could offer only a weak defense about cumulative stress and a momentary lapse in an otherwise stellar career. The administrative law judge looked at Rourke over his glasses. Captain, he said, his voice flat, your career was not stellar. It was, according to this report, a 25-year-long powder keg of arrogance that was simply waiting for a match. Inspector Sinclair's audit proves that your momentary lapse was in fact your true character. You are the poster child for human factors failure. You are a danger to the flying public. The ruling was immediate. Certificate permanently revoked. The fallout was total. Eleanor, his wife, had seen the writing on the wall. The public humiliation, the loss of income, and the sudden total erasure of their social standing were too much. She filed for divorce 2 weeks after his termination, citing irreconcilable differences. The house was sold in the ensuing fire sale. Marcus Rourke, who once commanded a $300,000 salary and a multi-million-dollar home, now lived in a one-bedroom rental condo overlooking a parking lot. His assets liquidated to pay for lawyers and alimony. But the karma was not yet finished. He was a pilot. It was the only thing he knew. Even without a license to fly, he could still teach. He called an old friend, a vice president of training at a rival airline. Jim, it's Marcus Rourke, he said, trying to sound normal. The pause on the other end of the line was deafening. Marcus, wow, how are you? I'm looking for work. Ground-based, a simulator instructor, you know my record. Yeah, Marcus, I do, Jim said, his voice full of discomfort. That's the problem. I can't. I'm sorry. You can't. What do you mean? I'm one of the best 767 pilots you know. Marcus, the Den 828 incident. It's not just a rumor. It's a case study. The Sinclair audit is being implemented industry-wide. Your name, your actual name, is in the new FAA training module on crew resource management and unconscious bias. You're literally the what not to do example. I can't hire the boogeyman, man. I'm sorry, don't call here again. The click of the phone was the final nail. He was not just fired. He was not just broke. He was a legend, a cautionary tale, a byword for arrogance and failure. The karma for the others was just as precise. Mark Johnson, the senior flight attendant, was terminated. He tried to sue for wrongful termination, claiming he was just following his captain's orders. His lawyer dropped the case after receiving the discovery file from Crosswind. His flight attendant certification was suspended for 2 years. Unable to find work in the industry that had been his entire identity, he was last seen working at a call center for a home appliance company, fielding calls about broken dishwashers. Brenda Lawson, the gate agent, was also fired. She took to social media, ranting that she was a victim of cancel culture. She was fired from her next job at a rental car agency after a customer complained about her hostile attitude, and her new manager found her social media posts. She ended up working the night shift at a 24-hour gas station, bitter and invisible. The only one to escape total ruin was First Officer Evans. He was suspended for 6 months without pay. He cooperated fully with Imani's investigation, gave a damning and honest affidavit against Rourke, and voluntarily enrolled in every assertiveness and de-escalation course the FAA offered. He returned to Crosswind a demoted man, flying regional jets out of a minor hub. He was shamed and his career was set back by decades. But he had a career. He had learned in the most brutal way possible the lesson Imani was teaching. Silence in the face of tyranny is complicity. He would fly again, a humbler and for the first time a much better pilot. The grounding of Flight 828 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an earthquake. For the next 18 months, Dr. Imani Sinclair's name became a verb inside Crosswind Airlines. To be Sinclair Ed was to be subjected to a sudden, unannounced, and ruthlessly thorough audit that exposed every flaw, every shortcut, and every trace of the toxic culture she was there to eradicate. The reckoning began exactly 48 hours after the incident, in the primary executive boardroom at Crosswind's Denver headquarters. The room, designed to project power with its dark mahogany table and panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains, felt like a morgue. Harrison Finch, the VP, had followed Imani's directive to the letter. Flown in on red-eyes and chartered flights were the company's entire senior leadership, the CEO, the COO, the board of directors, and most importantly, the chief pilots and hub managers from every major city. Chicago, Atlanta, Louisiana, New York. They were an assembly of the most powerful, senior, and overwhelmingly arrogant men in the company, and they were all, to a man, furious. Imani Sinclair stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 other stern-faced FAA officials she had summoned. Her aluminum briefcase was open. The mood in the room was electric with hostility. These were men who, like Rourke, saw themselves as kings. They viewed this grounding not as a wake-up call, but as a bureaucratic overreach, a personal insult. A senior captain from the LAX hub, a man named Frank Sullivan, who was a close friend of Rourke's, was the first to speak. "Inspector," he said, his voice a low growl of intimidation, "with all due respect, what you've done here is an execution. You've grounded an entire airline, cost us tens of millions, and ruined a 25-year veteran's career over a baggage dispute. Don't you think this is a little extreme?" The room rumbled with quiet agreement. Finch, at the far end, looked ill. Imani didn't flinch. She simply tapped a key on her laptop, and the audio from the incident began to play through the boardroom's high-end speakers. First, they heard her own voice, calm, professional, citing the regulation. Then, they heard Mark, the flight attendant, his voice saccharine and dismissive. Then the swoosh of the curtain and Rourke's boom. "What is the problem here?" The captains in the room, men who knew Rourke, shifted. They recognized his command voice. They heard Imani's calm, repeated attempts to de-escalate. And then they heard the climax. Rourke's voice, thick with venom, hissing through the speakers for all to hear. "I don't know who you think you are. Frankly, people like you should be grateful to be in this cabin at all. You need to learn to know your place." The silence that followed the recording was absolute. It was heavier and more terrible than any engine failure. The smug, angry expressions on the pilots' faces had vanished, replaced with masks of horror, shame, and for some, the dawning realization of their own culpability. Imani let the silence stretch for a full 10 seconds before she spoke, her voice ice-cold. "That," she said, "is not a baggage dispute. That is not a bad day. That is a catastrophic failure of character, judgment, and command. That is the sound of a man who believes his uniform makes him God. That is the sound of a pilot so consumed by his own ego and prejudice that he is a direct threat to the safety of every passenger he flies. You," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, "are the men who trained him. You are the men who promoted him. You are the men who created and protected a culture where he felt so untouchable, so completely without consequence that he dared to say that to a passenger in a full cabin, with his first officer standing right next to him. This is not a baggage dispute, Captain Sullivan. This is a cancer, and I am the surgeon you have called in to remove it. You are grounded," she continued, her voice rising with righteous power, "because your airline is sick, and the sickness starts in this room, with all of you. Marcus Rourke was not an anomaly. He was your star pupil." No one spoke. No one met her gaze. The most powerful men in the airline had been reduced to scolded schoolboys. "My authority here is absolute," Imani declared. "For the next 18 months, I am your new head of training. My team will be rewriting your entire operations manual from gate to cockpit. We are scrapping your pathetic online diversity modules and replacing them with rigorous in-person human factors and de-escalation training, which I will personally oversee. Every single one of you, from the CEO down, will be in a simulator with me, and I will test you until you break, or until you learn." She looked at Finch. "The Sinclair audit is now in effect. You may resume flying in 24 hours. But know this, I am watching. My auditors are on your planes, in your break rooms, and at your gates. The next Rourke I find, I will not just ground a flight. I will pull your certificate. We are done here. Get your notebooks. Class begins in 5. 6 months later, First Officer Evans sat in the right-hand seat of a crosswind regional jet, flying a rainy route from Des Moines to Minneapolis. His life had been hell. The 6-month suspension had drained his savings. His wife had nearly left him. He was a pariah among the senior pilots, seen as the rat who cooperated with the FAA and a coward by the junior crew for not speaking up in the first place. His demotion from the wide-body 767S to this tiny CRJ felt like a permanent stain. He was paired with a captain named Gray, a quiet, grizzled man who hadn't said more than 10 words to him. They were on final approach to MSP, in thick fog and driving rain. The workload was high. "Gear down, flaps 30, Gray ordered. Evans complied. "Gear down, 3 green, flaps 30. "Checklist," Gray grunted. Evans ran the landing checklist. Altimeters set, brakes medium, landing data, VREF 138, set. "Good," Gray said, his eyes scanning the instruments. "Run the visual approach check." Evans paused, his heart hammered. The visual check was for after they broke out of the clouds. They were still in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. The correct call was the ILS instrument approach. Gray had just made a mistake. A small one, but a critical one. The old Evans would have said nothing. He would have assumed the captain meant something else, or that he'd be corrected in a second. He would have kept his mouth shut, terrified of Rourke's fate. But as he sat there, his hands damp, he heard Imani Sinclair's voice in his head, cold and clear from the debriefing room. "Your silence makes you complicit. You failed." He swallowed the fear. "Captain," Evans said, his voice firmer than he expected, "we are still in IMC. I cannot perform a visual check. We are configured for the ILS 30 right. May I tune the frequencies, or would you like me to—" Captain Gray's head snapped around. He stared at Evans, his expression unreadable. It was the longest 5 seconds of Evans's life. He felt the blood drain from his face, expecting a Rourke-level explosion. Finally, Gray gave a single curt nod. "You're right. My mistake. Brain fade. Good catch, co-pilot. Tune the ILS, my aircraft." Evans let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. ILS tuned and identified. They landed smoothly, taxiing to the gate in silence. As they were shutting down the engines, Gray finally turned to him. "You know, Evans," he said, pulling off his headset, "I read the report on that 828 flight. What Rourke did, it was a disgrace to the uniform. And what you did, well, you failed." Evans flinched. "Yes, sir, I know. But," Gray continued, "what you just did back there, that was a pilot's job. That's what you're paid for. Took you long enough to learn it." He unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'll buy you a coffee." For Evans, it was the beginning. He had broken his own silence. 1 year after the incident, Harrison Finch sat in the same boardroom. This time, it was just him and Imani, who was there for her 12-month review. The change in Finch was remarkable. He was thinner, more tired, but less slick. The arrogance was gone. "Inspector," he began, gesturing to a presentation on the screen. "As you can see, our quarterly metrics are, well, they're what you predicted." The numbers were staggering. "Internal anonymous safety reports are up 450%, Finch said, clicking a slide. "It's not that we're having more failures. It's that our crews finally believe they won't be punished for reporting them. The culture of silence is breaking. Our passenger satisfaction scores after hitting an all-time low have rebounded 30 points. We're now leading the industry in de-escalation ratings." He showed her another slide, a new ad campaign. It wasn't about cheap fares or exotic destinations. It was about professionalism, safety, and respect. The tagline was, "The new standard of flying." "It was your phrase from the seminar," Finch said. "We leaned into it. Radical transparency. We admitted we had a problem, and we told the world how we were fixing it. It was the hardest thing we've ever done, and it's working." Imani reviewed the data, her expression neutral. "Your progress is adequate, Mr. Finch, but you are not fixed. You are in recovery. The audit continues." "Of course," Finch said. He hesitated. "On a personal note, I saw the final determination on Marcus Rourke. His appeal to the NTSB was denied. The board's final ruling was unanimous. They're permanently revoking his ATP certificate." "I saw that," Imani said. "The ruling," Finch said, reading from his tablet, "cited the audio from your debriefing as the single most definitive piece of evidence of command unfitness and racial animus they had ever reviewed. It's over for him. For good." Imani nodded. "Karma, Mr. Finch, is simply a new regulation that's been properly enforced." "And the others?" "Mark Johnson is stocking shelves at a supermarket in Atlanta," Imani said, closing her file. "Brenda Lawson is in a similar position in Denver. They are blacklisted. They will never work in this industry again." "Good," Finch said, and for the first time he sounded like he meant it. 18 months after the grounding, Dr. Imani Sinclair sat in seat 5A, an economy comfort seat on crosswind flight 828, from Denver to Atlanta. It was the final test. She was in her undercover attire, a university sweatshirt, leggings, and glasses. She looked like a tired graduate student. She watched as the new crew, younger and more diverse than Rourke's, prepared the cabin. As planned, her partner, another undercover FAA auditor, began the test. He was in 6C and he was being difficult, loudly complaining about the boarding time, rudely demanding a drink before takeoff, and refusing to put his bag under the seat. A young flight attendant, whose name tag read Maria, approached him. She didn't smile falsely. She didn't placate. She was a perfect model of the Sinclair method. "Sir, I can see you're frustrated," she said, her voice calm and firm, her body language open but non-confrontational. "We will begin beverage service as soon as we reach 10,000 feet as per federal regulation. For now, I need you to place that bag fully under the seat in front of you. It's a safety requirement for takeoff." "Or what?" the auditor snarled. "You'll get your captain? Go ahead, get him. I'd like to talk to him." Maria didn't even blink. She didn't run to the cockpit. She didn't escalate. She simply held her ground. "Sir, there is no need to speak to the captain. This is a simple instruction. If you cannot comply with it, you will be in violation of federal law. and you will be removed from this aircraft." "I'm not moving it," he shouted. Maria calmly took a small pre-printed card from her pocket. It was the new warning card. "Sir, I am now giving you your final written notice. Please read this. If I have to speak to you again about this, you will be met by law enforcement upon landing, and you will be subject to civil penalties. The choice is yours. We are waiting on you to close the door." She placed the card on his tray table and walked away, immediately turning her attention to another passenger. The auditor, his bluff called perfectly, huffed in performative anger, and then slid his bag under the seat. The plane was buttoned up and pushed back 30 seconds later. The captain never left the cockpit. The incident was contained, controlled, and concluded, all by a junior flight attendant who had been empowered to enforce the rules. Imani Sinclair leaned her head against the window as the plane took off. She watched the sprawling complex of DIA, the scene of the crime, disappear beneath the clouds. Her phone buzzed. It was an automated alert. Subject: Rourke, Marcus A status, certificate revocation, final, case closed. She closed her eyes not with a smile but with a grim, profound sense of order restored. Marcus Rourke had been grounded, a single, arrogant man pulled down from the sky he thought he owned. But in his place, an entire airline had been forced to learn how to fly right. The new standard was set. Her work here was done. And just like that, Captain Rourke's high-flying career was over, grounded permanently by the weight of his own prejudice and a single career-ending sentence. Dr. Sinclair's red flag grounding became a legend in the aviation industry, a permanent reminder that true authority isn't about the uniform you wear, but the respect you give and the rules you yourself must follow. The airline paid millions, but Rourke and his complicit crew paid with their entire careers. Justice served not at 30,000 feet, but right at the gate. What did you think of Captain Rourke's instant karma? Have you ever seen someone's power trip backfire so spectacularly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with a friend, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more real-life drama where arrogance and prejudice get exactly what they deserve. Click that notification bell so you never miss an upload.